absolutely delighted to be able to open this session simply by introducing you to Patrick McGrath, to Emma Dallimore, and to Lindsey Redpath. They're going to introduce themselves with their titles and what they do in talking about this very, very important theme surrounding dyslexia this afternoon. I say no more other than that. If you have questions, you can put them into the chat and we'll either break into the conversation with those questions or we'll wait to the end, depending on where we are in the conversation. But you're very, very welcome to ask questions. This is recorded and it is going to be put onto our media archive so that people have reference to it afterwards. If you feel comfortable asking a question, it'd be great for you to put your camera on for that as well. Otherwise, if you're not happy with having your face being shown, pop your question into the chat and we'll keep an eye on it. I'm going to hand over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think I now want to be you when I grow up, because I want to have to do the first 2 minutes on a webinar series rather than keep it going for the hour. So thank you, Sarah. Much appreciated. And thanks, of course, to our friends at ECIS for having us here, and a huge welcome to all of you joining us. ECIS, of course, you'll be joining us from all regions and territories in the schools community around the globe. So really, really good to have you here. I think Sarah has the first best job. I have the second best job, because basically all I need to do is keep the conversation going with two fabulous guests that we have on here today. And the first one that I'll mention as we go through is Emma Dallimore. Emma is Associate Principal of Wellbeing and Inclusion at the Leo Academy Trust. If you want to give us a wave there, Emma, just to make sure we know who you are as you go. I know Zoom tells us the names and all that, but I think that's really important. And we're going to find out a lot more about Emma. And then a colleague of mine, the wonderful Lindsey Redpath. Lindsey is a marketing manager in the Texthelp group here. Lindsey, you can give us a wave now too.
Hi, hello.
There you go. So what's really interesting for me to our attendees today, in terms of the guests that we have. So if we think about Emma, Emma's going to be able to share some very important insights as to what her trust's process and thoughts are around supporting pupils and students with dyslexia. What are the challenges that she sees? What are the statutory requirements? What are the steps that she puts in place? And then beyond that, I'll be looking at and filling in the blanks in and around how technology might support that. We all know we don't need to sort of rehash the amount of online learning that's happened over the last couple of years, and lots of that, of course, has stayed with us. So we'll be looking at where does digital technology plug in, and really fascinating today. And you'd be wondering, why have I got a marketing manager here from Texthelp? Is she trying to sell me something? Well, actually, I'm sure she is somewhere, because hey, that's your job, Lindsey. But the reality is that Lindsey's here because I discovered something about Lindsey a number of weeks ago in a wonderful interview that she did for us, which was that Lindsey has been in Texthelp for some time, and Lindsey has dyslexia, and she's very proud of that fact and talks about it very openly. But Lindsey's here to reflect on her journey through school, where it wasn't diagnosed, it wasn't obvious that that's necessarily where challenges lay, but just how that started to progress through secondary school, and specifically maybe through higher education, and the importance that the recognition of dyslexia and the strategies that we all need to put in place are really essential at all levels of school, and we're going to explore those as we go. And just as I thought about today, and with many things with me, people go, where is he going with this? Where is he going with this conversation? And the opening line of my notes here say, I went to the pub. But this is a very timely conversation, I think, about dyslexia. Genuinely on Sunday, went to my local bar for Sunday lunch with my lovely wife, sat there and could not help but overhear the neighboring table. There were 6 people at the neighboring table. I would say somewhere 50s and 60s, quite clearly a family, hadn't saw each other for a while, meeting up and having, as what we call here in Belfast, a bit of crack, a bit of fun and a bit of humor. But the conversation that I couldn't help overhear came around to dyslexia. And they were openly at the table talking about dyslexia and how they had struggled at school, and the challenges that they'd had at school with reading and with writing, and how they felt it was really, really visible now, and that it was open now that people could talk about these things and not think about people with some sort of challenge or some ability or disability, as they called it. And what struck me about that conversation was this was Sunday afternoon, 2 o'clock in a local pub. And it was an open conversation about dyslexia. It was a recognition about it, and also a recognition that there are there are ways that people can be supported now. And I think we're very fortunate that the world we live in now, the technology that's available to us can really help us. So we know assessment for dyslexia has improved. We know awareness clearly has improved as well. And then, of course, there's technology. And technology and tools that you have in your everyday devices, and you have in our tools like read and write, things like text to speech, very simple tools, but tools that can start to help people understand better. Why? Because text to speech helps you very simply listen to words and helps you focus on comprehension rather than the decoding of those words on screen. And that's fundamentally important to a pupil with and that lives with dyslexia. So other tools like dictation as well, alternative ways rather than handwriting on a page in this digital world, really important. So comprehension, expression, but most of all for me, and just before we get into our guests here today, is about inspiring and building confidence in our pupils to make sure they have the tools, they feel supported, they understand their recognition, and they don't feel that they're simply a pupil that struggles and don't receive the help. And I'm going to leave you with one last statistic before we go into our guests. And that is a shocking statistic for me. And that is globally, we know that there's, and you've probably read it if you signed up for the session today, it's estimated statistically that 1 in 5 students globally actually sit with some form of dyslexia trait. In UK and European schools and US schools, in fact, if you take those 3 regions, 17% is the actual statistic there. 17% of the students that sit in front of us in our classroom have a certain level of dyslexia. That may be mild, that may be severe. What's fundamentally challenging within there is of all of our pupils, less than 5% are formally diagnosed and actually assessed. So those are the pupils that are getting specific targeted support, we hope in all cases. But it's really important to recognize that there are many invisible barriers to dyslexia as well. Pupils who don't raise their hand, pupils that struggle in silence, and all the things we want to talk about today really reflect on that. So I'm going to stop talking now. That's my piece over, but I'm going to move very quickly on to Emma. And Emma, you are Associate Principal, Wellbeing and Inclusion. And at the outset of today, I said that's quite an unusual title. Can you maybe give us a little bit of a background to your role and maybe some context for those of us outside of the UK, what a trust actually looks like?
Absolutely. Thanks, Patrick. So as Patrick said, I'm an associate principal for inclusion, wellbeing and actually safeguarding across a MAT. And a MAT basically is a collaboration of schools who work together. We have a local MAT, so all of our schools at the moment are within very close proximity to each other. So it's schools working together on what we call economies of scale. So making sure that we can give the children the best possible offer, maximise the resources that we've got available and share the excellent practice that goes across those schools and the research driven practice that we're so familiar with using in our trust to make sure that we're getting the best for children. The role came about because I already was sitting at a leadership level. We were building our central team, and one of the things the trust very firmly believed was that we needed to invest in the support for our children with additional needs, that the needs were so varying across the trust that we had children who needed support and weren't necessarily getting the best that we had to offer, and we wanted to make sure that everybody was getting that. So when they set up our MAT, as it is at the moment, we have hubs, and the hubs are set up based on groups of schools within the small MAT that work very closely together, and then we all feed in to the overarching kind of vision, etc. So in addition to that, we then developed an inclusion and wellbeing hub, and the idea was that we could really use our own services within that to support schools, to support teachers, to support families. So within our inclusion wellbeing hub, we've got SEND experts, we've got a SEND central SENDCo, we've got literacy specialists, we've got SEMH leads, family support workers, so a real wealth of inclusion services that then can help to support those underlying needs for people. Just recently I've been seconded up to support an RI school, one of the new schools that we've taken on as head teacher, and I think what we've seen and what the staff here have seen is the impact that being part of a trust can have, and particularly on those children with additional needs as well.
So you clearly don't have a lot on, Emma, to be fair. It's a fairly quiet role. For sure. No, and it's a fabulous insight into a larger school community and the structures and the need in place. But I want to talk, obviously we're focused today on dyslexia support. And maybe just wanted to bring it back down to basics and talk about dyslexia. If somebody were to ask you outside of the school environment, what is dyslexia, Emma? How would you wrap that around and describe it? And how does it manifest itself in your students?
Yeah, I think there's a general stereotype out there that we find across kind of our trust and in education in general, is that dyslexia is simply somebody who cannot read or gets their B's and D's the wrong way round. And I think even the NHS definition of dyslexia, the initial definition that you'd read if you were to look at the NHS sort of websites, etc., the first part is talking about reading and writing and those being the biggest difficulties. And of course they are and they can be. But I think that the thing that we really need to kind of educate people on is that it can be much more than that. I feel that's quite a narrow way of looking at it. So we see children who struggle, for example, with coordination or organizational skills. They might have visual processing difficulties, challenges with working memory. So for us, it's been educating our staff and ensuring our provision is reflective of all of that. So it isn't just about reading per se or writing. It is actually about looking at how those other needs can present.
It's interesting, we talk about in SEN words, we'll talk about autism and we'll talk about the spectrum, but we very rarely talk about dyslexia and talk about that wide spectrum, of a single trait all the way through to a heavy level of dyslexia. So that's a very interesting point of view and thought. How do you then work with your teachers then to educate them on that? I mean, what's the process look like in terms of identification of dyslexia and its various forms then?
So I think for us, the thing that we've worked the hardest on, I would say, is understanding need. So to start with, thinking less of a diagnosis of dyslexia or ASD or any of those things, and actually really trying to unpick what the needs of the child are. What are the barriers that are presenting because of there being an underlying need there, and trying to address that through quality first provision. So as a trust, we completed an SEN review, an inclusion review across all of our 6 schools at the time. And we looked at like strategic leadership, provision that was in place, pupil perception, how well they felt they were being supported, families, feedback on support, etc. And then we used that information to think, okay, what is it that we need to do next? And what we then did is start to think about, our staff need to understand that if somebody is struggling, we need that forensic assessment to understand what the need is. So someone is struggling with reading, we know they're struggling with reading, but what is it about reading it? What is it about the process of reading? Is it sight vocabulary? Is it comprehension? Is it fluency? What is it that's causing those difficulties or those challenges? And then being able to very much drill down and match that, the support that we can provide to sort of close those gaps and to sort of to not remove the barriers, because you can't remove them, but to find ways to allow and empower people to be successful. So I think that's been the biggest key for us, and we've done that through an awful lot of CPD for our staff, both internally using the expertise we've got across the 6-7 schools that we now have, but also externally and looking at specialists coming in and supporting us and advising. And one of our SENDCos that we've taken on in a central role, who now leads across the trust on SEN, she is exceptionally talented in understanding the processes behind literacy difficulties, and she will go out and support in schools. She'll work with parents, she'll team teach with teachers. So we've got that, we've built it up over time, and there are people in every school now that are like the go-to person, but generally across all of the schools the provision has greatly improved.
Yeah, and you mentioned literacy a couple of times there, but you were at pains to say, I think, in the previous answer, look, this is not just combined there. And how do you get that provision that's level? Because obviously, there are dyslexic traits which will show up when we're hitting our numeracy tasks as well. How do you make sure that it doesn't stay focused on reading and writing and that very core literacy piece? Or do you define literacy just wider?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that. So one of the things we've started to use is sort of dyslexia screeners, but not in the way that people may think that they're used in terms of diagnosing. Absolutely not. They're there to help us further understand what the area of need is, because I think one of the biggest issues for teachers is that when you do your teacher training, there isn't a real huge understanding of SEN per se, but also in particular things like dyslexia, etc., that do present very commonly in classrooms now. And so I think that's something that as a system we need to work on for our teachers. So we've very much looked at that, and actually teachers understanding that things like organisational difficulties, coordination, planning, being able to follow instructions, they're across the whole of the curriculum and also in day-to-day life. So what we're trying to do is equip children with those skills that they can then apply beyond the classroom as well, because that's a life skill.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose then that beyond the classroom, but that extends, you talk about your parents hub as well earlier on. And so parents get brought into this in I suppose a more integrated way. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And I think we've had to do a lot of work with parents as well. Some parents are very quick to say, my child's dyslexic, I absolutely know it, based on that stereotype of my child's having their B's and D's the wrong way round, they're not doing very well with their reading, I think they're dyslexic. But actually what we then do is we have an initial concern system. So if we are concerned about a child, teachers are trained to complete an initial concerns form, which they complete with the parents. So the parents are a part of that process. We then look at what support we're providing within the classroom. So we look at that quality first provision, but then what else above and beyond. So there are things like, for example, visuals, chunking of work, additional time and understanding of need, like you said, dictation, peer support for each other, sort of daily organisation, grids and checklists and things. All of those would be standard practice across the schools as part of quality first teaching. But then we need to be thinking about, okay, is there anything we need to try differently, and what can parents also do at home? So an example of that is we had a child who we'd started this process with, and it was to do with the child being disorganised. Actually, it wasn't a concern that the child had dyslexia initially, it was the disorganisation and trying to unpick where that was coming from. And we worked with the parents, and they worked on checklists and visual timetables and everything at home, and found it really improved both behaviour and learning for the child. And then moving on later on, when they became part of the SEND support sort of the register, the parents then started doing toe by toe at home whilst we were doing a different intervention in school. So it's that real partnership with parents and educating them and supporting them to understand all of those things.
Would you say, just think one last thought maybe on the CPD part and working with your staff? And I always talk about this line, and there's always a different opinion comes back to me on this line, which is we want to make every teacher an SEN teacher. Would you agree? Is that what you're trying to do, or do you not follow that approach? Because everybody has a different viewpoint on that.
I agree, Patrick. I absolutely will. I think it'd be wrong for me as someone who's so passionate about inclusion to say that not every teacher should be a teacher of SEN. They absolutely should, because the way mainstream education is now, we are having children who unfortunately are having to stay in mainstream, and there are certain pros for that, of course there are, but we are having children with quite high needs, and not just children with dyslexia staying in mainstream school because there isn't specialist provision for them. So what we've done is looked at different models. So for example, at one of our schools where the Inclusion and Wellbeing Hub is kind of based, we've trialled a programme of having specialist teachers to come in and work alongside the teachers within school, and to provide specialist intervention for children, to look at the impact of that and to see whether actually there is rapid impact, and therefore that's a model that we would like to sort of deploy across all of the schools. So I do think that there is that quality first provision part of understanding different needs and being able to support effectively within the classroom, but in addition to having that specialist support. And I think one of the things I say about kind of getting dyslexia diagnosis is that we can only do so much within schools, because we are not SEND experts. We are here to support inclusion and to support anybody with additional needs, but we don't have that training of an educational psychologist or someone at a much higher level, and sometimes we do need to rely on that to really unpick, okay, so is it working memory, is it auditory processing, what is it that's proving the biggest barrier? Because not all people with dyslexia present in the same way. Everybody is unique, and you know, there is a perception, if you've got dyslexia, this is what the problem will be, and we just know that isn't the case.
Yeah, there's that box that we want to put everybody in that case. Yeah, no, thanks, Emma. And there's Lindsay, there's quite a few things that came up in Emma's chat there that I think really fit into your story. But just as an introduction, so you're a marketing manager at Texthelp, so that's a fairly literacy heavy role. There's a lot of reading and writing goes on in your role, Lindsay. And if I may give you the compliment, you do very well at it. But is that a challenge for you still in this day? And I want to go back to your schooling in a second, but it's a very central part of your role.
Yeah, you know, people always, I think, as Emma mentioned, put having dyslexia or living with dyslexia in the, you know, the stigma of, oh, you mustn't like reading, or you must be a slow reader. Or I get my B's and D's, my E's and L's mixed up. When I started to learn to drive, I had wee tricks that the learner sign was on the left, so I knew that was to go left or go right, you know. And you sort of learn little tricks. But being in like a marketing profession is a very creative job, and I think that's probably where being dyslexic, I am a visual thinker, I'm a visual learner. I although yes, like writing is important during my job, but also like that creative bigger picture. And I think actually being dyslexic and working in marketing is the perfect job for me, because I actually think differently, and I look at my peers and you know, sometimes I'm like, think they must think I'm mad because of the way that I like think, or the ideas or solutions that I come up with, because they just are a little bit different, or I come up with them in a different way.
But I suppose that's the magic behind it, though,
yeah,
Lindsay. And,
exactly,
and we would talk about it internally in Texthelp and talk about neurodiversity. And I think sometimes people think that neurodiversity was a term created by people like you and me just to sell something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's not, because actually, when you recognize those strengths that you have as a dyslexic, that's actually what they are. Like you know, those are strengths, that creative side and that alternative look at things side. And I'd be the first to admit, we're in meetings together and you'll say some stuff and I'll be like, really? And then suddenly it'll dawn on me that it was the best idea I've ever heard. But it's taken me much longer time to get with the program on that and hear your side of it.
And that's probably the challenge in the workplace, you know, that you probably have to convince people a little bit more. But to be fair, working in Texthelp is probably the perfect place to encourage that, because of what we do.
We're very open about it. I'm going to go back, Lindsay, to some of the points that Emma said that I know you've shared in your story before, but maybe you can share with our attendees here today. You know, Emma talked about, for example, parents, and I know your parents were very supportive, but I suppose in a more traditional way of, you know, we need to tutor you, we need to give you more help. It's not a dyslexic thing. We just need to make you work harder.
Yeah.
And there was also then some moments I remember from listening to your story where, you know, there was just this one teacher at a certain point had recognized the challenges you were having, going, right, okay, this is what we need to do. And that comes back, I suppose, to your point, Emma, which is if we train teachers to understand what they're looking for and understand how to put the mechanisms in place, whether they're SEN specialists or not, it can really help. But Lindsay, maybe you can share a couple of those things just with us, and your story of going from didn't know you had dyslexia to, well, actually, yes, I do. And this is where I got some help.
Yeah, I was very lucky that, you know, my parents were both teachers. So, you know, they recognized that the sort of what Emma was mentioning, I was a slow reader. I wasn't really that interested in reading because I was a slow reader. My spelling wasn't, you know, up to scratch with the rest of the class. So, you know, being teachers, they did have a voice, and they went and they really pushed for me to have an educational psychologist and really identify the problem. Sorry, I shouldn't even say problem, because it's not a problem, but identify, you know, my learning difficulty. And that happened in year 4, which is, I think, about 8 years old. And the solution at that stage was I got a pair of bifocals to help like increase, obviously, the size of the words. And I got a yellow overlay, and I used it twice. I remember I used it twice, and I was so embarrassed. I was the odd kid out, and so I just ignored that completely. I didn't want that, probably through a hissy fit when I went home or whatever, but that made primary school, to be honest, very difficult, because I was in a primary school that there was no one else in the class that I knew was dyslexic. I was the stupid kid, had to be in the low reading group. I had to go out to like what they called like the special class. So my confidence from a very young age was knocked. And we got to, in Northern Ireland, we have a exam, which was then called the 11 plus, that streamed you to go into your second year grammar school. And that was a struggle, because you were really, success was getting a good grade and going to the school that, all your friends were going to. And I was never getting there. Like I wasn't passing that exam. So I did fail my 11 plus, but I look back and it was actually probably the best thing that ever happened. I went to a school for a year that I was, it was a secondary school in Northern Ireland, and I was streamed when we went in, because there was a lot of different ranges of learners and abilities in that school. And I came out like by far the top. So my confidence had gone from primary school, I was a stupid kid, in this school, on paper, I'm the smartest kid in the whole school. Like, what's going on? I was so confused. And that actually led me to leaving that school, because I think that year I just caught up. I actually my learning caught up, my confidence was gained. And but my first reaction when I went to a school called Hunter House was, I went to my English teacher and said, I'm really bad at spelling and I'm really bad at English. So just so you know. And she goes, well, do you know what? Whenever you go to work, there'll be spell check. So don't worry about it. You'll be fine. And then I proceeded to love English. I got an A in English, and all it took was just a bit of confidence and a bit of support from the right teachers. And that's what was lovely to hear, like what Emma was saying, that was probably not around when I was in year before, that I doubt that was around. I'm 33. So, they probably didn't know how to support me, to be honest. And, so I don't look at it in any negative way. I just look at it as in a positive, that at least that's now been recognized, and there's a lot of work going on.
There was a word there, Lindsay, you used, and I know you were using it about yourself, and it horrified me, which was stupid. And we were, Lindsay and I happened to be at a dinner for the British Dyslexic Association on Friday night. And what really struck me, I didn't say to you at the time, Lindsay, was the number of people that got up on the stage and said, I was the thick one, I was the stupid one, I was the back. And the way those words were used really struck a chord with me. And I'm like, I have never been in that position where I was like, oh, I'm not the smart one in the class. And it really struck me that people were carrying that for so long. And then the second thing he said was, he said about the bifocals. Now, identify with those, because in primary 2 at 6 years old, they gave me these and they went, it's all right, you'll only wear them for a year. Here I am at 48 years of age, still wearing the damn things. However, the screen overlay and the stigma associated with that was the reason why you just went no. And that maybe comes back to our technology slant in this, which is if you had given back then every single pupil a pair of bifocals and a screen overlay in the room, you'd be like, oh, well, that's what everybody uses. And I think that's a great analogy for technology. And I know we do that with reading, right? We'll maybe come back to that, Emma, in a little second. But giving the same tool to every single student, stigma goes, inclusion raises, and suddenly everybody feels a little bit more included and can draw on the support they need. And I think that's important. So it's the labels thing there, I suppose, struck me more than anything. And I'm keen to come back. And I had a question for you. I was thinking just through, if you had earlier intervention, would it have helped you? But actually, it just needed to be intervention in a different way, because you did get it early, but you just didn't get it in a way that helped you and included you, I guess. Would that be fair to say?
That would be fair. And I think, that was 20 years ago, and being dyslexic in that time, you were, seen as stupid. Like, there's no doubt about that. That was the case. And, my parents must have spent, dear bless them, a fortune on tutors to cure dyslexia. It wasn't to help me learn in a different way. It was to fix it. And it was to fix it to tick the box of, she passed her GCSE, she went to uni, she got a job, because that's the way society in those days did see success, whereas now it's totally different. And there's even jobs out there that creative people who have dyslexia or different thinkers, you could go and be a videographer, you could be a YouTuber, you could be, you maybe don't go to uni at all, maybe you never pass GCSE maths and English, and what difference does it make if you're doing something you love that you're good at? That's fine. But I think now there's a lot more support for kids to think about things differently, and it's encouraged, which is a really positive sign.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to come back. Really fascinated to see how it changed for you as you go through into higher ed. But I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things you touched upon there with you, Emma, which is if we take Leo and we look at the digital world, which is what we talked about earlier, and you go, right, well, we're moving now and we're taking away, the challenges that maybe pen and paper and handwriting and those things actually could have caused challenges for. Suddenly we're in this digital world. Like, what sort of strategies do you deploy within the trust that can help students and pupils when they're online?
Thanks, Patrick. I think it's really, really interesting hearing that from Lindsay's perspective in terms of her experiences. And I think it comes to, years ago, there was the lack of understanding, wasn't there? So for us now, just listening to what you were saying about reading, for example, we don't give children who are struggling with reading low texts. We still give them access to that high level text, that exposure to that high level vocabulary, but because they can use the read aloud functions, for example, on their devices, and that has opened a world of opportunities for children. So I think we've got some really good case studies of children who were actually school refusers because they didn't feel like they could be successful in anything. They did see themselves as stupid. Self-esteem was very, very low, no confidence in themselves. But it's about finding children's strengths and also then using those as a vehicle to be successful, and giving them the tools like we use the Texthelp resources, all of the time, because it's a resource that all of our children can use. Like you say, the children don't stand out because it's a resource for everybody. So we've got children who will really struggle with planning their writing, so they might do the plan might be very short on a piece of paper. They might map it out then on like a Jamboard or something like that. They then use the voice to text to do parts of the writing, because the stamina of actually writing becomes a real barrier to learning, and actually books are closed and thrown across the room because I actually can't do it and you're asking me to do something I really, really can't do. So it has allowed us to really open that world for children to see themselves as successful and have exposure to high quality learning, which they are all entitled to.
I was talking to one of your colleagues, the lovely Cheryl, on a podcast. I don't know how long ago, a large number of months ago, and she was answering me a question about digital resources. And I said, "Oh, you're clearly doing universal design for learning." And she kind of looked at me on the camera as you're looking at me now, going, "Universal design for learning." And actually, what strikes me is the approach that you take, and she and the trust are doing these things without having a label slapped on it to say we're taking this approach. And that is the standard of reading material is the same. There's nothing adaptable after the fact. It's let's get every child access to the same resource in the same way, but I guess give them the tools that can help them interpret, consume, understand it a bit better. Would that be fair to say? And is that still the case there at the trust?
Absolutely. So giving exposure to those high quality texts, having the vocab dictionary, so that if they come across a word that they actually can hear but they don't understand, they can find out what that word means. They've got the picture dictionary there. So it's all of those tools that as adults we use now, don't we? If I don't know the answer to something, what's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to Google it, because there will be an answer out there that I can find. So we need to teach our children that they've got these tools that they can access. Everyone's going to be using devices in the future, and we've just had a review of our school, and we've obviously introduced technology very rapidly at this school in the last 18 months, and we had people from specialist provisions here doing the review and mainstream, and they described it as seamless, that our children don't remember they have a device in the classroom because it is part of their everyday learning. They use it as the same as picking up a pencil, as same as picking up a piece of paper. And I think that the other thing that's been really successful is that bespoke learning. So gone are the days where we make all children write a story story in a textbook on a piece of paper. Our children do write, they do handwrite, but they can present things in different ways. They can do a Google slide, they can do a podcast. We can get those learning objectives delivered in a much more creative way, drawing on their strengths in the way that Lindsay's described, because we all have that in us, you know, and it's giving people the way that they're in our school. It's allowing them to thrive basically in the way that works for them.
And it's just, so it's a one-to-one environment then, just for those joining the webinar. And I suppose that comes back to Lindsay's point. She was talking about the screen overlay. And whenever I'm talking about read and write as an example, you know, the audible gasps from teachers, sometimes there's a screen overlay, and something as simple to me where there's a colored overlay on a screen, the difference that makes. But I guess in a one-to-one environment, whether it's the inbuilt tools or tools from us or Claro or Upright or any of the other great tools that are out there, the fact that one pupil in the corner of a classroom can sit and just click the button and their peers don't need to know and they can have access to that, I suppose can make that difference. And that, you must see a lot of independent learning with that regard, because there's no necessarily need for the hand up at times, and there's kind of, the pupils have the confidence to drive their own learning in that regard and seek support. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, all schools are seeing the same difficulty with a decrease in the number of support staff that they have in schools. But actually, our children don't need the same number of adults now, because they're far more independent in their learning. So where before they'd have to get, so I'm stuck on this, I don't know how to read this, can you help? They can do that themselves. They've got that resource there and they can access that independently. And we are definitely seeing much more independent learning and a far higher level of engagement in learning from our children.
And you talked about the review there. And by the way, for those of you who didn't catch us at the start, Emma's literally just threw a review, and I think took a gasp of breath at round about lunchtime just before she came on here. So nice one on that. But that review that you talked about, you know, you mentioned some of the feedback was it's seamless. So clearly there's a very blended approach to support. And I guess you try and balance it between that, the physicality of pen and paper to the digital devices, and just make sure that's quite continuous. Is that the kind of generalized process?
It is, absolutely, and across all subject areas, across the whole curriculum. But also I think we still do have things like toe by toe is being used, and it's a book, and it's turn the page each day and do the activity. But for some of our children, that is what works for them, and it is looking at the tools that are going to allow a child to be successful in both intervention but also in that just day-to-day experience of learning.
It's funny you say that, Emma. You know, I have been on more panels and discussions than I think I care to remember at this stage. And there's one question that people always ask, and you're going to get one of these questions near the end, you know, that the one thing question. But people always say to me, Patty, what's your one thing? What one thing could we do to have ed tech, you know, incorporated better? And my answer is always the same. It is provide opportunity. We can buy as many tools, we can do as much CPD, you know, we can have all of the steps in place, but if we don't, as practitioners and as educators, simply go, right, I will give you the opportunity to use this when it is appropriate for you to use it, and empower our pupils to use that, I think it's all lost. There's no point having a one-to-one program and a lot of CPD if we're not just going, there is an opportunity to use this. A number of years ago, I worked with a school, and it was a one-to-one school, and the biggest complaint from the parents was that all of the devices that have been bought for the pupils, because parents in that particular school bought them, they were phoning the school to say, my son has never taken it out of his school bag. And it was an all boys school. And that's a crying shame. That opportunity, you know, the tools exist. We know dictation, you know, helps with writing. We know read aloud helps with reading. Give them the opportunity. Like, really important. And one thing on that, and I want to come back to Lindsey in a second on this, because this is a really important piece, is you're talking very heavily, Emma, about primary. Okay. So what happens to your pupils? They get to the end of, and look, I always confuse this between all of the international schools I work with. They go into year 7 in secondary in England. Am I right? So for year 6 year, we go from P7 to first year. It's all very confusing. So when they move into secondary level, how do you or can you not ensure that they have access to adequate provision? Because and let me explain the context of that. A lot of the schools in the ECIS community will be all through schools. So they'll benefit from the perspective that they have a fairly contiguous system throughout, and hopefully have well-developed handover procedures between the various levels of schooling. But how do you deal with that, or can you not?
I think it's something that we're continually working on with our secondary schools, because it is an ongoing problem. They don't have the same level of devices, but what we do find is for children who have got additional needs, they have devices and they can provide them with those adjustments and that support. But what we're trying to move away from is a child needing something in addition. It actually should be that provision for all that's going to benefit everybody. So we're continually working with our secondary schools and with the local authority where we're based around how we can try and support people to bring that into our secondary schools, because I think they'd have a much lower rate of children not engaging in school and truancy and all of those things if like the model we've seen, we can really engage those children. I mean, from personal experience, my son is in primary at the moment. I know that if my child doesn't get the support he's getting now through the use of our digital strategy, because he happens to go to a Leo school, he will be a school refuser when he goes to secondary. There is absolutely no question, because he's really struggled. But this whole digital world has opened up education for him, and I think that's the key. It is, you know, children have access to digital when they're in the real world and they become adults, but we can't stop that in between. You know, we can't go to secondary and us not have access to that, but suddenly in the real world, that's what we'll be using to support us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things there that we see, and this is peculiar to the UK, and apologies to all of our EU visitors on this, but what'll happen there is I find anyway in the system, if the transition isn't done well into the upper level of secondary school, then there's that drop off for those first few years, and then suddenly we go, oh, there's high stakes examinations testing, and now we need to put support in place again, and then it stops again until higher education kicks in. And as Lindsay said earlier, higher education is obviously not for everybody as we go, but Lindsay, you got through then, so you went through that curve, I guess. Support and exams with things like text-to-speech, I guess, as well at high stakes level. And then you benefited from what we call in the UK DSA, Disabled Students Allowance. And I know you have huge issues with that label, but Disabled Students Allowance, and that give you what to go through university?
So yes, in the UK there is the support, as Patty mentioned, with the DSA, but I actually didn't find out that I was eligible until third year of a 4-year course. So it was actually by chance. In third year, you start your dissertation, you get a mentor, and I mentioned that I was dyslexic, and my mentor was just like, oh, great, well, you've got all the support then that you need. And I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And she pointed me in the right direction, and I got a needs assessment, and I could not believe what was available to support me, from a fully funded laptop, printer, dictaphone, software, extra time in exams, exam reader if I wanted, private room for exams if I wanted to do them on computer. It was endless, and I probably, at the age of 20 didn't even take all the support that was available to me. So there's a big gap there in awareness, and partly of what you mentioned is I do have an issue with the name of it. I probably maybe did see it and didn't think that I was disabled, so I probably didn't think to inquire or apply. But that, to be honest, helped me. Like, I got a first class honours in business marketing, and genuinely without that support I don't think I would have. It really, really helped me through like the 2 years of studies that were the most, tasking and difficult.
You realize your story here. You went from 10 minutes ago saying I was the stupid kid, and you've just said I've now got a first class honors. And because, and I know, Lindsay, my wife's dyslexic as well. She's head of department at a large grammar school here, all boys school, physics, technology, all the stuff. But only 2 years, she's 44 years of age. She'll kill me if she's ever listening to this. 44 years of age. But 2 years ago was when she first got diagnosed. So she in her eyes, she built coping mechanisms all her life, and just went, well, I just have to study harder, or I just have to, I have to read the book 3 times before I understand it.
But
and
she
just
even
went,
that's
just me.
And I had to do that because I didn't know what support. So I, like, my friends would have taken, the mickey out of me because I was the one in the library at the start of the day, at the end of the day, because I had to work harder. It didn't come naturally, and I just had to work harder. It took me longer to process things, but it paid off, and I'm actually glad in a way, because I think it made me a harder worker, into my work as well,
ethic,
and just everything, to not take for granted that things come easy.
And what I find fascinating, and I know you did let your age slip earlier on, right? So, but okay, we'll just say you're in your 30s, okay? But you're in a high profile position in Texthelp. Emma will be dealing with, pupils primary 1, primary 2, and entry level. They'll actually be using the exact same software tool and things like read and write, or the inbuilt tools, as you'll be using in 30 somethings in a high level marketing role. It's exactly the same tool. And I find that a fascinating thing. The technology is genuinely, whether it's our tools or anybody else's, it's that leveler that if we provide it, and we provide the consistency of it throughout school life and work life, and the strategies that the pupils and students and employees can employ, they'll have that there for life. And I think that's really, really important. Would you agree with that, Emma? You're nodding your head there vociferously on the,
Patrick, I'm just thinking about myself and how much I've used voice to text for my own work-life balance and for my own well-being, because I don't have to be sat at my device. I can be cooking the dinner for my family whilst I'm talking into my phone, and actually preparing notes for things and what have you, because those thoughts do go around your head at those times. And I have got a terrible memory when it comes to things like that. I'll think, oh, I had a really good idea, but what was it? So it's having those resources at hand to allow you to do that.
That's a good point. Actually, I was using our toolbar, and my brother was in my house, and he's a physiotherapist, and he said, can I get that because he has to manually write all of his notes after each patient, and it's very tasking, and sometimes he's straight on to the next patient, so it's trying to get that minute. So he now is using the voice to text feature, just based on me seeing it. He's like, I did not know this existed. This is unbelievable, and it'll save me so much time. And that just shows everyone can benefit from these tools, and they help you if you've dyslexia or any learning difficulty, or just not, And
I think that comes all the way back to your glasses, which I'm not going to get out of my head now, your glasses and your acetate sheet, because thinking about it from a personal perspective. So my daughter's 17, currently doing some high stakes sort of end of school year exams, but whenever I started in Texthelp, so a number of years ago, I said, have you ever heard of this read and write thing? And no, you guys have it in your school? And she's like, no, my cousin uses it. She's dyslexic, and had that kind of look. And I was like, all right. So literally about it, and I thought I'll not get into this conversation now and try and educate my daughter about this. But about a year later, I could remember being in the house, and she was studying for some end of year exams, and I could hear what I was sure was read and write or text to speech in Spanish. And I'm going, what? No. And actually, as I walked into her room, this little girl who said, I don't need those tools, and it's for somebody else to use, was actually using the same tool as her dyslexic cousin was using, just to help her with her Spanish orals. That's all it was about. It was just to help her with her Spanish orals, and it was helping her learn. And I went, isn't that such a great leveler? And I think it's a fabulous story, and genuinely didn't plan it. I was like, why am I hearing this weird sounding Spanish voice echoing through my house? But I think that leveler is key. And I suppose as we just start to wrap up, guys, and it is genuinely one of those, I think we could talk for another hour, no problem. But the word that I've picked going through and listening to you, Emma, and to your insights, Lindsay, is one of consistency of the CPD we put in place for our teachers, and awareness for our educators, the consistency of provision of tools, the removal of stigma, is there, consistency through all ages of our school cycle that we have, and indeed our further and higher education cycle all the way into the workplace. There's nothing to stop Sarah, you and I, using these tools and these inclusion strategies as well in the jobs that we do every day, outside of this. And I think that's a fascinating insight there. But also, I think what's important, and interested in something you said earlier, Emma, I'm a big fan of those small steps. And I think Sarah talked about it at the outset there, but those small steps, and you talk about helping in small ways. And I go, look, I don't talk about adaptability of content, but I do talk about accessible content. And I say, look, one simple thing that I can do is just change the font to a dyslexic friendly font, but I'll do that for every single person that'll ever read a document. And most people won't know the difference, but those with dyslexic traits will just know it and they'll be able to read it better. And the other thing that I try and do is just double height the spacing between the words. And we do that as standard in Texthelp as part of our outside comms and stuff as well. And we have very, very focused on things like that. But I think in the school environment, like there's 2 or 3 or 4 simple things we can all do when we're writing a Google document or a Microsoft Word document that just helps that little bit more, just ratchets it up. Would you agree with that? Because it's not just about all of the tools that we've talked about. It's those small things can make huge, huge impact.
Yeah.
100%. Sorry, Lindsay, do you want to go?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, you know, one thing, even being in the workplace, it's like appreciating that everyone has different tactics and everyone learns differently, and don't try and make one size fit all, because we're not, you know, you can't build robots or machines. It's everyone's got different ways of learning, and sort of appreciate it. Don't question it, and use everyone's skills to build the right project, or, you know, the right classroom, whatever that is.
Yeah. And I know at the outset, and when our wonderful friends at ECIS, and they are genuinely wonderful friends at ECIS, and we work very, very closely together, they talked about this panel discussion being very much centered around sort of digital technology. And don't forget that this digital technology is available pretty much everywhere on any device that you go on nowadays, whether you pick up your phone or you're using Read and Write on a desktop, or Claro Read, or you're using App Writer, or you're using anything that's built in. All of those tools are there, but just think about the difference that audio can make, or dictation can make. So listening to things and speaking, very simply, 2 very obvious things, but actually the level of inclusion that we provide by giving opportunity to tools like that doesn't get away from the amazing practice that our educators put in, the work that you do, Emma. You know, I know technology is only a small part of that, but it's a very essential part of that leveling and consistency. And actually, Lindsay, your screen masking, of course, as well. You know, that acetate sheet is just a click away going forward for millions of pupils around the world.
Let's try and find it in my parents' house. Sure, it's somewhere in the attic.
I remember going into a computer lab, and it was clip on the screen.
Yes,
you know, it had a big hooks, and it just clipped on the front of the screen, and I remember being there. But ultimately, you know, as we summarize, I want to come back and just think about that opportunity piece we talked about earlier is so important, to provide opportunity to access to the right support, to deliver independence, to help confidence, to help our pupils be more collaborative about seeking their own inclusion around things. And as we wrap up, I wanted just to come back to the panel, to you, Lindsay, and to you, Emma. And I'm going to ask you what everybody hates in my panels, which is that one thing. Now, you're lucky I don't do the whole one word, where you can have a sentence or even a paragraph at this one as we wrap up. But I'll start with you, maybe, Lindsay. What's the one thing you would suggest to all schools listening? I mean, from your experience, you've been through the system. What's the one thing you would suggest to all schools listening that can really help change mindsets or practice for pupils that live with dyslexia every day? What would you throw out there?
Oh, it's hard to pick one, but I would probably say, if I probably am thinking of it more for, you know, what would I say to kids, or what I say to colleagues as teachers, and even colleagues that I work with, is like, be sensitive to these, like, people that are living with, like, you know, conditions or learning difficulties. You know, just be sensitive. Don't assume that, you know, they didn't feel stupid growing up, or don't assume that, you know, they feel comfortable writing on a board or reading out loud, because that's can cause a lot of like stress and anxiety in young people, and not just from a kid, but right through to you know, an adult. So just be aware of, like, your classroom or your workplace is now likely more than ever more neurodiverse than it's ever been. So just be aware of everyone, and so treat that with kindness and respect, that everyone's different. And if we weren't different, how boring would the world be?
No, absolutely. And Emma, same question to you. What's your one thing going forward?
I think the thing that I wish we have more of is that continuous professional development for anybody in education, because ultimately, if we don't get it right in primary, we are going to switch children off of learning, and therefore they're not going to have those high aspirations, that confidence, that self-esteem to reach their potential that they're so, you know, so able to achieve, you know. And that's
it's about capturing it early and putting the mechanisms in place. Yeah, rather than just going straight into coping mechanisms or people just struggling. Yeah.
And Lindsey talked about that one teacher who really unlocked learning for you. And for me, that should be, all teachers should be able to unlock that learning for all children, and no child should be left to feel that they can't thrive, you know, because the support is there.
I don't know if anybody's watched the Adele special where at this moment they went, and that teacher Adele that made a difference in your life is here. Unfortunately, she's not here, Lindsey, but
I know. Do you know what? Actually, my school that I went to have asked me to come and do a talk on Prize Day. So I can't wait to see her, because she wouldn't have a clue.
Yeah.
You know, I hope she's still there. Actually, I hope she's still working.
And it's, Sarah, you and I talk about it. It's that ripple effect of making these small changes, you know, and inclusion in the language that we use and the way we speak, and the reduction of labels really can cause a huge ripple effect. I'm quite sure, Lindsey, that teacher will never know, you know, the difference that they've made in, you know, in your life. So I'm going to go back just to round up and go back to the pub on Sunday, and just think about those 6 people that sat there and they talked about dyslexia in a very open way and went, I think that's what one of them said, that's what was wrong with me. And aren't pupils so lucky now that they're able to get help and support? And I could not believe that I literally said, I kid you, this is not fabricated or made up. I could not believe it. And my wife thumping me like this in the arm. But fabulous to hear it. But I think that's one of the things that we can take away today, that we are openly talking about these things now. We're not hiding them out of the way. We're not suggesting that there's only a small subset of students that we need to help and support. We're talking about consistency. We're talking about providing independence. We're talking about building confidence. And there's a comment just I see here on the chat, and it says how we as educators can move the perception of our classes towards a fairer learning environment. And I would just add the word fair and more inclusive learning environment to that comment from another Sarah, actually. Because I think that's really good. And she goes on to say in the comment, if you haven't read it, how can we model opportunity in our attitude? And I think that's really, 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 really important. Language matters, recognition matters, diverse, you know, recognition of the diverse learners, Lindsey, as you have said, really, really matters in those strengths. So I hope you've all found this really, really useful. I want to thank you, Emma, of course, for taking time out of your busy day. I'm sure all you wanted to do was a large glass of wine after that review today and go home early. Lindsey, you always want a large glass of wine and go home early, but no, I joke. But Lindsey, thank you so much. I always love hearing your insights to this, and I listen to that more and more. And back to you, Sarah, for I told you I wouldn't, I would stick to the time, albeit with 15 seconds to go. But Sarah, again, thank you to you and our friends at ECIS. I hope the attendees have found this valuable, and we'll of course be on hand. At Texthelp, I'm sure Emma will be open to it too. Any questions that come in after today, funnel them through ECIS, and we'll be more than happy to get back to you and help you in any way we can. Sarah, anything you need to say in closing there?
Yes, just a very, very big thank you to you. First of all, to the people that came and attended. We've got colleagues from all around the world who've joined us this afternoon. And as we said at the beginning, this is a recorded session, so people will be able to watch it from the ECIS website. But I'm just going to go back to your point about the fact that we are, as Texthelp as a company and ECIS, we are certainly friends and very good friends, and the relationship here between the two organizations goes back a long way. And Texthelp are sponsors, regular sponsors of events that we have at ECIS, for which we're extremely grateful, and we work very closely as partners together. So Patrick, Emma, Lindsey, thank you so very, very much. Some of my takeaways today are about that sort of spiral of success building success, and that really endorsed by Lindsey's story there of seeing ourselves as successful helps us to move from finding our strengths, as I think Emma talked about, finding strengths as a vehicle for building success. And so we take your conversation today in the light of the whole sort of DEIJ that we, the lens through which we see everything at ECIS, thinking in terms of diversity, that it's not something that we're trying to cope with. It's actually something we're engaging and wanting to strive towards, for all the reasons that Lindsey was explaining, that by being part of diverse teams, we actually increase the possibility for creativity and new solutions. And so the very fact that you found yourself perceiving, or perhaps find yourself in teams perceiving the world in different ways, means that you're bringing ideas to the group. And that's what we want everybody to be able to do in their different ways. So I love the fact that you were able to turn around what once upon a time would have been something, would have had the R factor with it, where we'd all felt sorry for people with their so-called deficits. And what you've done is to turn this into a beautiful strength, which makes you a powerful person in a team. I'm really grateful to you for this wonderful conversation today. And if anybody wants to get in touch with any of the panelists today, from the people that are listening in, you know where to find us. Throw your questions in our direction, either at ECIS. You can write to me directly, Sarah at ecis.org, or you can contact Texthelp. And thank you very, very much indeed. And we'll say thank you and goodbye now. We'll turn off the recording, and we look forward to seeing you after the summer again.
Thanks, everyone.